Today on Profesh Sesh, we are going to take a moment and recognize, yes, believe it or not, International Update Your Resume Month. And our talent specialist, Alisa Walters, who has seen many resumes in her career, is going to share with us some best practices and some things you might want to tweak. Alisa?
Yeah, this is very exciting. I'm kind of geeking out a little over this because obviously my 9 to 5, I spend all day, every day looking at resumes. So I think that the most important thing, and this just kind of being a best practice for any professionals, recruiters included, is that you should always keep your resume as polished and as up to date as possible. That's going to be number one, is that look at your resume. Maybe it's every couple months you go back and you update it, maybe once a month, but any kind of recent accomplishments that you've um, or accolades that you've received or you've accomplished, any acquired knowledge, that should all be stuff that you're adding to your resume, on whether it's you're getting certifications every month or every couple months. But really, what you don't want to do is like be in a position where you are either you've hit your limit with your job, you can't take it anymore, and then you've got to you're going to start looking for a job, or you've lost your job, or whatever the case might be. It's good to have it ready to go, because if you're trying to recall a couple of years worth of um, accomplishments, experience, um, key performance indicators that you've met in your previous role, it's going to be hard. So you want to make sure that you're doing that along the way. And then just take a look at the resume, the aesthetic of the resume. Is the resume, what does it look like from an aesthetic standpoint? I will say personally, and I think that a lot of colleagues would agree, is I do not like gimmicky resumes. If it's a gimmicky resume and it's got a lot of graphics and pictures and things like that, for somebody who's looking at resumes all day, every day, that's something you want to keep in mind, because you want to you want to allow somebody who's reviewing your resume to be able to have a breather. So that white space and that very clean aesthetic, um, that's something that as a recruiter we appreciate. Making sure that your font size is pretty much consistent across the board. Obviously, you want to have your headers a little bit bigger, but standard font size 12. Using clean fonts like Cambria, Serif, Calibri, Verdana, those really clean, consistent fonts, and you want to keep your fonts consistent throughout your resume. Also, line spacing, that keeping it single within the bulleted points. Maybe you double space your headers, but really just clean, consistent, and thorough. So I'll take a beat there. Any thoughts or follow
Well,
up
it's so
questions?
funny because as you were explaining, like, that you were kind of geeking out over this and started you mentioning that no matter where you are in your professional journey, that you should take this moment to update your resume. I was literally writing down keeping current, no matter where you are. I love that. And it's so true, because I think we've all been guilty of that. I know I
Yeah.
have, like, where, I felt like, okay, it's time to start looking for work. Let me update my resume. And it's like,
Mhm.
it's such a heavier lift. But if you take the time to do this periodically, not just on International Update Your Resume or during International Update Your Resume Month, but periodically taking a moment to say, hey, let me update, to your point, accolades, awards, when your role changes, when new responsibilities are given to you, it's time to do that. And I also added to my notes, do that to your LinkedIn profile as well, because that's an
Yep.
extension of your resume.
Yes,
Absolutely.
100%. And you want to include, and if it's not on there, you want to include your LinkedIn profile on your resume. That should absolutely be on there. The other thing that I think I want to call out, and I recently received a resume that someone had asked me to review. And I want to talk about that objective and summary section for a moment. is that when it comes to, objectives is that objective statement, I really think is a thing of the past. You want that summary to be your branding tagline on your resume. So you really want to hit that summary statement pretty hard. You want to use those knockout words that you see in a lot of job descriptions, and things like, if you're aiming for a leadership position, are you a transformative leader, strategic leadership, results oriented. So really capturing those words that you might see in some of those job descriptions for the roles that you're applying for. This particular resume, most recent experience, seems to have a pretty big title with the word director in it. So though, if that's your most relevant experience, you want to be hitting those knockout words pretty hard. So transformative, strategic, impactful, using metrics. People love to see data. So being able to tell the story of things, the size of teams that you've worked with. If the sales oriented goal, what are the sales metrics that you've hit? So that's also when we talk about keeping your resume polished and up to date, those things that you can show, that you're not just telling, in whatever, in 1 year, you've grown a team from 1 person to 12 person or whatever it is. So you really want to paint that picture with whatever you can. That's why, when people, we talk a lot about interview styling on here. So things to also think about when you're laying out your resume is you're listing those hard skills, those technical skills that you might have, but you really want to call out those soft skills as well. What sets you apart? You're goal oriented. You're you're an effective communicator. Those kind of things are all soft skills that you can build your tagline around. What really sets you apart? So I think that it really just goes back to, Vanessa, you said about if your job has changed, if you're taking on additional responsibilities, use your personal review at your current company as a way to also enhance your resume.
Great
Because
advice.
yeah, there's areas, in your current job that you could be documenting this as well, that's easily transferable to updating your resume.
So, Alisa, I have a question because you used terms like effective communicator, goal oriented.
Mhm.
I feel like, how do you make your resume sound different from everybody else's? Because every job posting I've ever looked at, I was actually laughing about this the other day, says needs to work well in a fast paced environment. I mean, I want somebody to say needs to work well in a slow paced environment just to be different, you know? But if we're all, so I guess I have a two-part question. One is, if we're all kind of using those same buzzwords, they feel almost like off the shelf. I'm organized. I'm a collaborative person. I work well with others. So that's one question. How do you kind of stand out? And then the second question is, we've talked many times on this show about how a lot of times we're going through algorithms to get to a real person, and those algorithms flag certain key terms. So where does that play into all of this? And should you be customizing some of the verbiage in your resume to the job description?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question first. So with every job, right, it is, you have to take a step back and look at, and unfortunately, finding a job is like a full-time job in and of itself. It does take work, and it can be really frustrating, and people feel very defeated. It can feel very personal. I mean, it is personal, even though it is business. But you have to think about what your resume's role is in that hiring process for that job. If you are looking at a job specifically that, you see this job title, you see the job description, you read it, and you're like, this is everything that I'm doing. This job is made for me. You have to make your resume made for that job. If that means updating that that summary, that tagline, your branding statement, if you will, to incorporate the words. You're creating this resume for two things, or you're an ATS, or a robot, and then also a human, a hiring manager, human resources. So you have to be strategic in how you put this resume together, at any level of your career, because you do want it to stand out. You do want that one thing that's going to intrigue somebody to want to dig deeper into your experience. So I think, most relevant experience, tailoring each job resume to the job descriptions from the jobs that you want to go after, is going to help you be a standout candidate for that specific role. And then the first part of your question was, how do you avoid those, I'm going to say it, corporate cliches, where it starts to feel like, okay, well, if I'm using all of the same words, collaborative, results oriented, that kind of thing, that's where it is so crucial to not just state those words, but show in your resume how you are those things. We talked a lot about behavioral based interviewing, right? Where it's like, in that interview process, should you get there, those kind of questions that a hiring manager or an interviewer might be asking, in a way where they're having you give you an example, give them an example of how, I'm just going to throw one out there, but so a hiring manager might say something like, well, tell me about your most difficult leadership challenge. They're assessing team leadership. They want to see what you're describing and how you handled that challenge. Do the same thing on your resume. That's where, and this is getting ahead of myself here, but I always encourage my candidates going in for an interview to always research the STAR interview method. That might be something that you apply to how you build out your resume. And I think that it just goes back to doing the research on the company, that particular job. And you really do kind of, unfortunately, you do have to tailor your resume, I feel, for the job that you want.
And Alisa, I know we've covered. Oh,
I was just going to ask her to clarify STAR. Excuse me.
Me too. We're on the same page.
I have to just reference my notes here as to, I want to make sure I'm giving the exact
the word for each, the acronym,
yes,
like the words that apply to each letter.
Yep. So situation, task, action, results. So situation, you're painting that specific picture of the situation you're faced. What was it? Who's involved? Why did it happen? The task, you're explaining your specific role in that task. Why were you involved? What's the background? Action. This is where you discuss specifically actions you took to potentially resolve this situation. And then also why you chose to complete a task in a certain way. And then results, obviously the detail, the results of your actions, and describing that in detail. What's the outcome? What was your personal feeling towards that? Was this a learning experience? What did you take away from that situation? And how was this, how were these results, how did they impact you as a professional in this moment? So STAR, and I think being able to answer questions in that consistent and concise format, that might be a way that you start thinking about, okay, well, if that's if I'm being asked questions specifically about certain things, maybe STAR can be helpful in how I frame my resume. I think that, we're obviously in the year 2021, and I think there's so many things that have remained consistent. I think from aesthetics point of view, when it comes to your resume, I think that you also want to reflect on your resume and look back on, people ask, oh, well, what's your thought about a one-page resume, right? I think a one-page resume, if you can realistically make your resume one page, I think that is ideal. But it depends on every person's situation, every person's level of experience, right? But I do think you also, when you're doing that check-in on your resume to update, to polish, look back on the years and see what's not relevant. I think from an HR perspective, a recruiting perspective, looking at dates, you don't, unfortunately, unconscious bias exists in places, and there is age discrimination. And I do think that it is important that you are mindful of how far back you are going. And I say that because it is something that a lot of companies are really trying to be better about, and not, perpetuating an unconscious bias around age, and somebody's who's been maybe working for X amount of years. But you want to make sure that you are really focusing on your most relevant experience, and your how you can be impactful in that future role. So that's I'm something that I may, people may not be happy with me saying that, but I, working in talent acquisition and working with hiring managers, whatever I can do to show that this person is the most qualified for the position because of the skills that they bring to the table, I want to be able to do that. My relationships with bringing in the right talent, I want to be able to emphasize what they can do for the company. And I want to help alleviate any unconscious bias. But again, not everybody is like me, and not every company. So that's some food for thought.
I just wanted to go a little deeper with that, because what if you have a resume where you have really great experience, but it is pretty far back? So, for example, I used to be a TV news reporter, but it was 15 years ago.
Mhm.
And, you know, I'm aware of age discrimination and walking that fine line between what I'm capable of and what maybe the stereotype of somebody in my age would be. So, how do you navigate that if you want to include really relevant experience on your resume, but you don't want to put the dates?
Yeah. I mean, you could put something along the lines of that's standard. If we're looking at a resume and we're seeing that chronological list of somebody's experience, you may get to a point on your resume where maybe if we're going back 10, 15 years, and you want to show that, you worked with these organizations and you were in this particular role, as an added value to the skill set you bring, I might put something like, um, past experience, make that a little header, and just list it.
Mm.
Reporter, anchor, this station, maybe even the location, and then just kind of have that's where I might say you might just want to do kind of a list.
I like that.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah. And
I
that
like that
you're
actually.
not calling out in that specific situation. If somebody wants to do a little bit digging deeper, you're not necessarily listing any bullet points, but you're just listing some of those other positions that you held.
That's really
Good
smart,
advice.
Alisa.
Mhm.
That's really good advice. And I also like kind of going back when you said during your review that could be a really good time to put on your calendar to set some time aside to update all of the things, LinkedIn, resume, etc. I want to touch on something that always I think is another lift, even before you get into piecing together your experience or changing your current role, all the things, is resume style slash design. And as you mentioned earlier on in the conversation, objective. Objective used to be kind of like a standard on a resume. That's the first thing you started out with, and now it's kind of obsolete and you do something different. What is your advice, or maybe you have resources for templates online of where you go to find the most current looking formatting for a resume?
Yeah. I think, I would kind of sway away from a word template. I think, if you are just starting out and you're like, I don't even know what to do here, that's a great option. Um, I I've mentioned this before we went live. I am really loving Canva right now, with everything that they offer in terms of um, uh, social media templates and things like that. I would, especially if you want something that is still aesthetically clean and effective. I think that that's a great place to look for some more basic looking templates. I think, a simple Google search of images is going to generate some really great, just a simple resume 2021 and looking at the images. Um, you can always default back to the Word document because that's where you should be creating your resume. But I do think that that I do think that you should tend to avoid some of the templates that are baked into a Word document. And also your colleagues, your peers, ask if they would mind sharing their resume with you, especially if it's somebody that you see maybe necessarily seemingly doesn't seem to have a hard time finding a job, right? They seem to get interviews, and people seem to reach out. I think it's asking, hey, would you mind if I look at your resume? I'm trying to get ideas. I'm having a really hard time. I would just love to see how somebody else lays out their resume. And if it's something that appeals to you and you feel like that is in line, um, ask them if they mind if you copy their template. I Years ago, I had a resume that just was, oh my gosh, it was a terrible resume, and it was one of my first jobs out here in LA. And my friend's girlfriend at the time, she was in a pretty high level position, and she was like, I'll take a look at your resume. And she line by line went through and said, this is what I would do. And she shared with me her resume, and to this day, that is the resume template that I use, and it is so basic. There's no bells or whistles to it. It's just evolved. It's gotten, more in depth in terms of my experience and my accomplishments and things like that. But ask your network. I think that, and somebody that you hold to a high regard when it comes to, um, from a professional side.
Mm-hmm.
Does that example resume that you rely on to this day live somewhere on the web that we can point our listeners to?
I can I think it might be on my LinkedIn profile, but I will make sure that it is on my LinkedIn profile.
we like resources for our
Definitely,
listeners.
definitely. And then Alisa, really quick before we wrap up, going back to formatting and different levels of your professional career, having experience at the top versus having, your collegiate career at the top. Just touch on that really quick because it does evolve as you mature in your professional career. So let us know your tips on that.
Yeah, I I always tend to keep my education at the bottom. And that's education, certifications, things like that. From a chronological standpoint, if you are a recent graduate, maybe you want that closer to the top. Maybe you want to show that maybe that master's in journalism from Columbia University that you've just completed. That is something that might be something that's eye catching if we're on the topic of news jobs. That might be something that's an attention grabber. Or if you just completed your JD from University of Michigan, or whatever the case might be, you might want that as something that's at the top. I think that's really dependent on where you are in your professional career. But mine sits at the bottom. I think that there's different types of resumes. Some people like to keep everything chronological. Some people like kind of having the combination of chronological and functional, or some people just really like to have something that's a little bit more functional that really kind of highlights your, my skills, the relevant experience, but may not necessarily be chronological. So I think it's a personal preference, and depending on what industry you're in, that education might be more of a draw.
Is there, I'm going to ask one last question. I know we're running short on time, but is there like one common mistake that you see over and over and over and over again that people are making that would be an easy fix?
I would say check your grammar.
I thought you were going to say grammar or spelling. Yeah.
Yeah. Spelling, grammar. I think, again, some of the more gimmicky with the graphics and all of the moving pieces, because also sometimes those, while they might look pretty when you're creating them and they might look really cool, when you upload them to an applicant tracking system, that doesn't always translate.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that grammar is a big one. And I think that calling this out, specifically going back to a resume that I had recently reviewed, is when you are in your most relevant experience in a role that you are currently doing, you want to make sure that you're that interchangeable words between your past and your present. Like if you're managing something currently, you're that is managed versus managed. So you want to be mindful of your past and present tense in your resume as well.
Alisa, what are some of the top 3 things that have been eye-catching, that have been a draw to a resume for you as a recruiter?
I do love a breathable resume, something that is just everyone's, mindful of their margins, 1-inch margins, all 4 sides, consistent font. And then I really like when I'm filling right now a role that we need somebody who's a YouTube expert and a YouTube specialist. And skimming resumes, when people specifically call out the success that they've had, that they can measure, and those data points that they can capture. When somebody tells me they've grown a YouTube channel from 0 to 4 million, I like when somebody gives me something that's on paper seemingly tangible. That is something that really excites me.
Great. We'd love to see that. We'd love to see that candidate.
I was going to say, we need a YouTube expert too.
Yeah.
If anybody's listening. Well,
Awesome.
even well beyond International Update Your Resume Month, this is fantastic advice. Thanks, Alisa.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Recording stopped.